let's talk about Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Now, this guy was a titan, a real giant of philosophy, whose ideas on freedom and education pretty much helped build the modern world. But today, we're going to get into the brilliant and, frankly, the deeply troubling life of the man, often called the father of modern education.
You've probably heard this one before. It's his most famous line. And wow, what a line. It became a rallying cry for actual revolutions. What he's really saying is that we're all born good and pure. But society? Well, society is what corrupts us, what puts us in chains. It's such a powerful, liberating thought.
But hold on. Here's the shocking question that just complicates everything. How could the man who wrote the book on raising free and natural children abandon all 5 of his own? Yeah, you heard that right. Let's dive in. Okay, so to really get a handle on this massive contradiction, we first have to understand the ideal, the perfect world he was preaching. And that perfect world is laid out in his masterpiece on education, a book called Emile.
You have to understand, when this thing came out in 1762, it was absolutely revolutionary. See, at the time, kids were basically treated like tiny, badly behaved adults who needed to be disciplined into shape. Rousseau comes along and says, nope, you've got it all wrong. He believed education should nurture a child's natural goodness and curiosity, not stamp it out.
Now, it's really important to know Emile wasn't a real boy. The book is basically one giant thought experiment. Think of it like a simulation where Rousseau lays out, step by step, exactly how to raise a child the right way, from infancy all the way to finding him a wife. It was his blueprint for the perfect education.
Okay, so that's the beautiful theory, the celebrated gospel of child rearing. Now, let's pivot to the shocking reality, because the man who wrote this stuff, well, his story at home was something else entirely.
5. That's the number of children Jean-Jacques Rousseau had with his lifelong partner Therese Levasseur. And every single one of them was given up at birth to a foundling hospital, an orphanage. And in the 18th century, these places had brutally high death rates.
The disconnect is just staggering, isn't it? In his books, the duty of a father was sacred, the most important job a man could have. In his own life, he walked away from that job 5 times. So the big question is, why? How on earth did he justify this?
Well, we actually have his side of the story from his autobiography, Confessions. He claimed he was too poor to give them a good life. He said the stress of a family would stop him from doing his important philosophical work. He even tried to argue that it was a common thing to do in Paris at the time. He tried to frame it not as a crime he committed, but as a personal tragedy he suffered. But here's where it gets even more complicated. For all his excuses, it's pretty clear he was tormented by his choice. He wrote these words about himself, a moment of pure self-condemnation. He's basically admitting he failed a sacred duty and knew that the guilt would haunt him forever.
So, you might be thinking, if this guy was such a massive hypocrite, why are we still talking about him? Well, the simple answer is because his other ideas were so unbelievably powerful, they literally helped topple kingdoms. So let's zoom out for a second to understand his massive influence. You got to picture the time period. Rousseau was writing at the absolute peak of the Enlightenment. This was an explosion of intellectual energy. And he wasn't working in a vacuum. He was in constant and often fierce debate with absolute giants like Voltaire, Diderot, and Thomas Hobbes.
And maybe his biggest debate was about human nature itself. Thomas Hobbes famously argued that without rules, life is just a brutal war of all against all. Rousseau completely disagreed. He argued we start out as noble savages, naturally good, compassionate, and free.
So for Rousseau, evil isn't something we're born with. It's something we learn from society. He believed the trouble all started the moment one person drew a line in the sand and said, "This is mine." That was the beginning of private property, inequality, and all the things that corrupt our natural goodness.
So what's the fix? The social contract. But Rousseau's version was radical. He argued that a government is only legitimate if it follows the general will, the true common good of all its citizens. This wasn't about protecting the king or the wealthy. It was about serving the people.
Which brings us right to his legacy, this constant battle between the deeply, deeply flawed man and the monumental ideas he left behind for us.
And his legacy is enormous. I mean, his ideas about the general will and how the powerful are corrupt, that literally became a philosophical blueprint for the French Revolution. Leaders like Robespierre saw him as their spiritual father. And the irony is, while he was alive, he was condemned and exiled for his ideas. But after he died, he was transformed into a national hero.
In 1794, they literally dug up his body and moved him to the Pantheon in Paris, the highest honor for a French citizen. The man became a monument.
And his ideas on economic justice, they feel just as revolutionary today. This quote just nails it. He's saying that real freedom can't exist when there's extreme inequality. It's a message that still hits hard centuries later.
And so, we're right back where we started. Rousseau gave the world these unbelievably powerful ideas about freedom, equality, and how to raise children. Yet, he failed to live up to them in the most personal way imaginable. So what do we do with a legacy like that? Can we separate the creator from the creation, the ideas from the life? That's the impossible question Rousseau leaves us with.
Have you ever heard of a book so dangerous it was publicly burned and banned? A book from 1762 that was so powerful, people actually blamed it for helping to overthrow a king? Well, that book was Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Emile. And get this, that wasn't just some historian's opinion. That's a quote from Napoleon Bonaparte himself. The guy reportedly carried a copy of it with him into battle. He even made a special trip, a pilgrimage to Rousseau's tomb. He was convinced that this one book changed everything. So you've got to be wondering, right? What on earth was written in this book that got everybody so fired up? What made this part story, part philosophy lesson called Emile so incredibly revolutionary? Well, let's get into it. Now, to really understand why Emile was like a bombshell dropped on society, we first have to picture the world it was born into. We need to step back in time and see what it was actually like to be a kid in the 18th century. So if you were a wealthy kid back then, your life started with being sent away. Right after birth, off to a wet nurse you went, sometimes for years. Your body would be wrapped up tight in swaddling clothes, so you could barely move. And school, it wasn't about finding yourself, it was about harsh discipline and learning your place in society. Rousseau looked at this and saw a system that churned out emotionally stunted adults who were totally disconnected from their own nature. So that's the grim backdrop. And into this rigid, artificial world, Rousseau comes along with a solution that was as simple as it was explosive. His golden rule? Follow nature. That's the very first sentence of the book, and really, it's the key to the whole thing. Rousseau's idea, which was a total bombshell at the time, was that people aren't born bad or sinful. We're born good. It's society, with all its expectations and rules and pressures, that messes us up and makes us unhappy. So, if we're born good, why are so many people miserable? Well, Rousseau thought he had the answer. He said our unhappiness comes from this giant gap, a canyon, really, between what we want, which is limitless, and what we can actually do or have, which is, well, limited. And society just keeps telling us to want more and more and more, making that gap impossible to cross. All right, and here's where his thinking gets really wild, especially for the time. See, the common wisdom is to chase your desires, right? Work harder, get more stuff, increase your power so you can get what you want. Rousseau says, nope, you're doing it all wrong. He completely flips the script. The only way to be truly content, he argues, is to shrink your desires until they match what you can actually achieve. Just want what you can have, and boom, happiness. Now, to get this big idea across, Rousseau did something brilliant. He didn't just write a list of boring rules. He told a story. He invented a fictional student, an orphan named Emile, and he walks us through this ideal, natural education, all the way from birth to becoming an adult in 5 clear stages. So this is basically our roadmap for the rest of the journey. We're going to follow Emile through each phase, from being a baby learning only from nature, to a kid learning through his senses, to a teenager learning only what's useful, and finally to a young man figuring out his place in the world. Okay, stage 1, the baby years. The big idea here is simple. Let the kid be a kid. Get rid of those swaddling clothes, let their mom nurse them to build that crucial bond. And this part is key. Don't freak out about every little bump and scrape. If little Emile bonks his head, the tutor doesn't rush in. He lets him feel the pain. the natural consequence. That, Rousseau says, is how you build a tough, resilient person. This leads right into his famous and kind of strange-sounding idea of negative education. So from 5 to 12, the teacher's main job isn't to teach things, it's to protect the kid from bad things. You're shielding their heart from vice and their mind from errors. His classroom isn't a room, it's a field. He learns by running and playing and doing, not by sitting and memorizing stuff from a book. Okay, Emile's a teenager now, and things start to get practical. He learns science, but not from some boring textbook. No, he learns it by watching the sun rise to figure out directions. And get this, he's only allowed one book, just one. It's Robinson Crusoe. And why that book? Because it's the ultimate guide to fending for yourself. It teaches him how to solve real problems using nothing but his own 2 hands and his brain. And this is where you really see how smart Rousseau was. He basically predicted that a massive, society-shaking revolution was just around the corner, a time when being a nobleman wouldn't mean a thing. So to survive, Emile needed a real skill. His choice? Carpentry. Now the irony here is just incredible. The actual king, Louis XVI, the one who would, lose his head in the revolution, he was taught using some of these same ideas and learned to trade himself. Locksmithing. Wild. So in these final stages, Emile goes through what Rousseau calls a second birth. This is basically when he becomes a fully social human being, developing feelings like compassion and empathy. He starts learning about love, politics, and morality. The whole goal is to prepare him to step into that corrupt society and somehow stay a good person. As you can imagine, the book's impact was huge and immediate, but its legacy is, well, it's messy, super complicated. So was Rousseau a brilliant genius who changed education forever, or was he a deeply flawed guy with some truly dangerous ideas? On the one hand, you can't deny the good. I mean, thinkers like Immanuel Kant were so blown away they literally broke their daily routines just to keep reading it. We have kindergartens today thanks to the educators who were inspired by Emile. It put the child at the center of education and gave the French Revolution some of its most powerful ideas about liberty and human rights. But, and this is a really big but, there's the other side. When Rousseau starts talking about how to educate Emile's future wife, Sophie, all those revolutionary ideas about freedom, they just vanish. He straight up says a woman's education should be all about making her a good wife for a man, to please him, to serve him. It's a life of submission. And that brings us to the most shocking contradiction of all. The man who wrote what might be the most famous book on parenting in history never actually raised his own kids. He had 5 children, and he abandoned every single one of them to an orphanage, which back then was practically a death sentence. So where does that leave us? What are we supposed to do with a legacy this broken? How can you separate the genius from the monster? In our own time, a time of helicopter parenting, endless after-school activities, and crushing academic pressure, Rousseau's 250-year-old message to just follow nature, to trust experience, and to let our kids just be. It feels more radical and maybe more important than ever.